Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be with you. And one thing to mention is that I've lived in Singapore on two occasions, in 1988, long time ago, and also in 2002 and three. My wife and three daughters, we highly value our time there, and love to visit whenever we can. So we're probably going to be on sabbatical next year in 2024 in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where we've had sabbaticals, and we'll surely come down and visit. So it's good to be with you today. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I hope you can see that okay. And what I want to do is actually give you some of the latest findings from our database, our encyclopedia. This is our World Christian Encyclopedia. I'll give you a little background to start out, because it's good to understand where all of this came from. So we'll start with this. I want to tell you that we began our work in 1957. At least that's when my mentor went to Africa, and he was going to be in the British Royal Aircraft Establishment, and he was doing research. He loved that, but they reassigned him to missile and bomb design, and he was essentially a pacifist. So he left that and trained for the priesthood in the Church of England. Was ordained and then appointed as a missionary to Kenya. So that's the beginnings. Although we actually really put our beginnings as a research center, which you heard that I'm running a research center in 1965, because that's when Barrett decided to put together what he was learning and incorporate as a research center. So you might notice that puts us on track to be in business for 60 years. So we're actually one of the longest running research centers. And of course, we study Christianity in detail in each country, but he started in Kenya and then began to look at other countries. In fact, we have in an archive here, we have all of his passports and documents. And he traveled to 212 of the 223 countries in the world between the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that's quite a feat for somebody in that time. It was much harder to do it. In 1961, he traveled from Mombasa, Kenya, to Bombay, Mumbai now, where he rented a motorcycle and toured the Indian subcontinent, went up through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Iraq, and finally ended up back home again in England on that trip. So this is part of our legacy. In 1968, Barrett published his dissertation, his doctoral dissertation, on 6,000 movements in Africa, offering a rationale that there's an independent brand of global Christianity. And what I mean by that is, I think most of us think there's three major arms of Christianity. There's the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Protestant churches. But Barrett made the case that there's really a fourth. There's independence, and I think I'll return to that a little bit later on. The other thing is, in 1970, he published this article that there would be 350 million Christians in Africa by the year 2000. This is important because a lot of sociologists and other scholars were predicting that by the year 2000, religion would disappear altogether. So here's Barrett saying, well, I'm in Africa and I see what's happening here. The famous sociologist Peter Berger wrote in 1968 in the New York Times here in the United States that by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. Now, here's Barrett saying, no, religion, Christianity is growing, and it's going to eventually be 350 million Christians just in Africa. By the way, our later research, once we got past the year 2000, was that there were 360 million Christians in Africa. So that's pretty close, considering that most people had a completely different idea about where things were headed. Then Barrett expanded from Africa, studied all forms of Christianity, and published the World Christian Encyclopedia in 1982. Now, Richard Ostling wrote the article there on the right. He was the Time magazine journalist, and he called the World Christian Encyclopedia a miracle from Nairobi, because remember, it was done in Kenya. And he called Barrett the Linnaeus of religious demography. Now, Linnaeus was the Swedish taxonomists who developed a way of categorizing all kinds of insects and other things. So this was a statement that here's a person who is studying Christianity all over the world and putting different people into different categories. Okay, so that's really part of who we are too. And that's what I was alluding to with the independence earlier. Then Barrett moved to Richmond, Virginia as a consultant with the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board in 1985. And that is where I joined him in 1989. In fact, I went from just under a year working in Singapore. This is in 1988 then, and ended up in working with Barrett the next year in Richmond, Virginia. Then we began publishing, or Barrett had already begun publishing, an annual table, a statistical table that appeared every year in the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. It's now called Mission Research, and the Britannica Book of the Year, which was an encyclopedia that came out, a single volume came out every year and updated, statistics on Christians and on different religions around the world. And we're actually still doing the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. You can find it at our website, which is just globalchristianity.org. And then we're also providing a statistical table for the World Almanac. So what I'm saying is we're informing the Christian world about what's going on, but we're also informing the wider world, because we're one of the few groups that does this sort of thing. Then after joining Barrett in Richmond, we produced the World Christian Encyclopedia second edition in the year 2001. And we put a second volume on it because we wanted to list the world's peoples and languages and cities and provinces, which of course we're right at the point when all of that there wasn't a place to put all of that online yet. So it ended up in a volume. Now it's online. One of the things I like about David Barrett is his sense of humor. And as we published this book, he was asked to speak to a group of wealthy individuals who wanted to speed up world evangelization by using their money the most strategic way. So they asked him to come and speak on it, but unfortunately for them, we were studying Christian martyrdom. So he offered the idea that maybe Christian martyrdom was the most effective means of evangelizing. So after an awkward pause, one of the donors asked, Dr. Barrett, what is the second most effective means of evangelization? So we have a lot of fun with our material as people try to figure out how to use it for strategic purposes. Okay. Then a couple of years later, I moved our center to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And we moved from being a standalone research center to one attached to an educational institute. And now it's the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. We have 15,000 books, 1 million documents, and so we're in a proper situation. We're also in the proximity of people studying Christianity from other institutions. So just yesterday, I was at Boston College, and we had about 75 graduate students there listening to 3 different presentations on Christianity in China, because we just have the Ricci Institute moved from San Francisco to Boston College. So we were celebrating that. And each of our institutions have people who study Christianity in China, most of them from China. So it's exciting to be up here in Boston, where there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. Then we did manage in 2003 to publish online our material in the World Christian Database, and that was followed by other databases that we've done, and we're just about, probably in the next few months, we're going to update this to make it more visual. We're going to use data visualizations and that sort of a thing. So we're excited about that, not just books, but also, an online presence. And one good thing is, when you produce data like this, it's used by different media outlets, and we talk pretty regularly with the BBC, The Economist, New York Times, and other media outlets around the world to help try to understand what's happening in Christianity. In one ironic twist, because remember I said that Peter Berger predicted the end of religion by the year 2000. He moved to Boston University, and then in the 1980s, he said, I was completely wrong. Religion is growing, and we need to pay attention to it. So I actually started working with him as a research fellow at his institute. And from that, we launched the World Religion Database, which is a second database, which was more focused on surveys and other things like that, in order to show where all these numbers come from. And in fact, we also have been working harder on that question, because it's really the first question people ask us when we say there's 2.5 billion Christians in the world. People say, well, where did you get that number? Okay, so we've been working on explaining where these numbers come from, and essentially our method, which is important. And the short answer, by the way, of where this comes from is 3 major sources. One is government censuses, but only a half of censuses ask a religion question. So the religion question is asked in Singapore, but it's not asked in the United States. So you have that kind of a situation. Then there's surveys and polls, especially where there hasn't been a religion question in the census. And then we use data from the religious communities themselves. So this is a big, huge volume that the Catholic Church collects every year of statistics on every one of their dioceses around the world. And many others collect this, and other communities as well. So there's actually 13 sources, but these are the 3 biggest sources, just to put that in front of you. All right, and then we had the privilege of publishing an atlas, because most of our work is just lots of tables and graphs and stuff. So it was nice to do an actual atlas. And this was 100 years after the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, 1910. And here we are in 2010, looking at where Christianity is in the world. So again, we're actively involved with the Christian community in trying to assess what's happening around the world. We also have launched a 10-volume series on Christianity in each country, each region and country of the world. These are the first 4 volumes. We're just about to publish volume 7. In fact, all these cover all of Asia and Africa, these four, but then we move to Oceania, to Latin America, and we're just about to publish the North America volume before moving on to the 2 Europe volumes, and then we're going to do another atlas, but this time a smaller, compact version. And these books are expensive in their hardback form, but we have paperbacks as well, so much more affordable. All right, and then as I mentioned, we did the 3rd edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia in 2019, basically showing the situation in 2020. This is what pages look like. I chose Turkmenistan because it fits on 2 pages. Most of them are a little bit longer. So we have a map, we have some data, we talk about the various religions in a particular country, what's been collected on censuses, and then a short history of Christianity in a country. And you'd be surprised, perhaps, in Turkmenistan, which is a majority Muslim country in Central Asia, you'd be surprised to hear that there are probably many Christians in Turkmenistan by the year 400. So, before most of Northern Europe. So one of the things we're trying to do today is to de-Westernize our thinking about Christianity, even historically. The majority of Christians in the world between the time of Christ and the year 923 were actually Africans and Asians, not Europeans. And yet the story, when you go to Bible school or seminary and you take a church history class, it's all about Europe. And that's not even accurate. And it's certainly not accurate again today, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so in our encyclopedia, we want to make sure that we highlight different Christian activities around the world, and you'll be familiar with these things like Bible translation. Most people in the world have some access to Christian scriptures, but there's still a lot to do. And it's especially when you talk about distribution and engagement. And of course, the scriptures are central to the Christian faith. So this is a very important enterprise as we go forward in global Christianity. And especially now that Christianity is so diverse, the Bible is even more significant in who we are as a global faith. Then education. Churches have been providing education all around the world, primary, secondary, especially in countries where governments aren't able to do so. And the Catholic Church, for example, runs 95,000 Catholic elementary schools around the world. So, and of course, Protestants, evangelicals, Pentecostals, everyone's involved in education to some degree. So this is a big contribution of Christianity around the world, and especially for girls, since girls are often the last to be given this opportunity. And it's been easily shown that when girls are educated, the world is a better place. So we wanted to make sure to highlight that. Then we also are paying attention to climate change. And this is a picture from Oceania, from the Pacific Islands, showing that many Christians, and a lot of Christians in the Pacific Islands, many Christians are losing their homelands to climate change. And of course, it's not really their fault because they're tiny little communities, and it's the huge industrial communities that have been pouring CO2 into the atmosphere for decades. And these are the people who've suffered the most. So Christians in Oceania have actually given a call to the rest of Christianity to pay attention. And many of them actually are going to be moved en masse from their own islands into New Zealand or Australia or someplace. So this is a pretty serious thing. So, and then refugees, we want to make sure that that refugees are featured, especially since Welcome the Stranger is one of the most ubiquitous phrases in the Bible, the most frequently seen phrases. So certainly Christians would be at the forefront of reaching out to refugees, although there's problems with that because some places there's a lot of pushback. And then healthcare, Christians around the world are active in providing healthcare in rural and poor areas. So not just schools, but hospitals and so on. You're probably familiar with that. Fighting poverty around the world. And actually Christianity is growing fast in some areas that have very few resources. So there's obviously, as Christians, we have a responsibility to all of humanity. And the Romans, in the first century were upset because Christians were taking care of everybody, not just their own people. But we also do have a responsibility to Christians who need help around the world. Okay, we want to say that. And then women make up the majority of church members in most countries of the world, and they're the most active in service. So when we asked someone to help us find photographs for the World Christian Encyclopedia, we began to notice that a lot of the activity was actually done by women. And yet most of the leadership is male, and we're not going to see an evangelized world. We're not going to see a world where the gospel is demonstrated as well in social action, unless women have a more significant role in leadership in the church. So that's one of our findings. And despite the fact there's many different theological positions about it, it can't be ignored in a group like ours who studies this. And one of our scholars is coming out with the first ever textbook on women in world Christianity in May. So we're pretty excited about showing what this means. Now, let me give you a quick overview of what's happening. So, we're talking about studying 234 different countries, but then what happens when you put all of this together? Well, first of all, it doesn't look too good in one sense, because Christians have been about a third of the world's population for the last 120 years. But that hides the fact, of course, that there's a lot of changes underneath this 1/3 of the world's population. And I should say that this is referring to Christians of all kinds. So it's the Protestant churches, but it's also the Catholic churches, the Orthodox churches, the independent churches, and then movements like evangelicalism and movements like the Pentecostal charismatic movement. So all of that is included here. This is everybody when we're looking at these kind of statistics. Because if you're going to compare to Muslims or Buddhists, then you really have to take the very widest definition in order to be consistent. So that's one thing. So here's the big news that you're probably well aware of, and that is that Christianity was largely a northern or Western religion in 1900. 82% of all Christians were Europeans or North Americans. So that's where this comes from. It was a reality. And remember, the first 1,000 years of Christianity, Africans and Asians were in the majority. So there's a long period of 800 or 900 years where Europeans were in the majority. And that's why now we have such a problem conceiving of Christianity as truly global. But our beginnings were clear, and where we are now is also clear. So here we are, 82% in the north. And then if you go to the present, here we are just 33%. So Christians in the global south, which is a United Nations designation, are now 67% of all Christians, which is more like it was in the beginning of Christianity, in the first millennium. We're back to that kind of a composition globally. And we have to, if you read the scriptures, and you come across, Psalm 67, all the peoples will praise him. And you look at Revelation 5:9 or 7:9, I saw a great crowd, and they were from every tongue, tribe, nation. So that kind of a Christianity looks like more like this, you see. So this is it's an aberration for Christianity to be in one part of the world among one cluster of peoples. That's not who we are. This is who we are, like this. Okay, and here's what it looks like on a graph. You can see how profound it is. It's actually a great time to be a Christian in this kind of situation. So we can rejoice together. There's still a lot to do, but we're in a much better place to do it, as you can see here. And that's why it's so shameful to consider Christianity as a white religion. And that's the perception today, is that it's white, which of course is not the case. And one of the reasons it's considered this way, white or Western or Northern, is that white Western theology training is dominant and still exported around the world, and music as well. So there's a challenge here. Instead, we're global. In reality, we're a global faith. And that's the strength of our faith. That's the irony, is that what the rest of the world needs is not a Western faith, but a global faith, one that makes itself at home in the world's peoples. All right. So you're also probably aware of the fact that Christianity around the world is stronger in some places, demographically speaking, or just the numbers or the percentages. And that continues to be the case. And if we compared earlier maps, we'd see that places that there were more Christians, like in Europe, have gotten lighter in the blue color here, which just indicates that Christianity is actually shrinking as a percentage, both because of secularization, but also immigration. And by the way, it'd be good for me to say now that for me, an ideal world, if a third of the world's population is Christian, an ideal world would be where a third of every country and a third of every people is Christian. I mean, you want Christianity to be distributed. You don't want it to be in one place. But of course, that can't be controlled. But just conceptually, to think that that's a more ideal situation. Okay. Then here's all those traditions, and you can see that these are uneven around the world. If you know Latin America, you realize, well, that color is probably Catholic, and it is. And you look at Russia up there, that's the Orthodox color. And then Protestant is the green, and this is the groups that are in the majority by province around. There's 3,000 pieces of information here, by the way. And yet you see also the darker purple color, and that's the independent churches. So, for example, in China, the house churches are the most numerous of all the churches, and they're an example of what we call independent. Now, sometimes they're called Protestants. There's a reason for that, but really, from our taxonomy, from our way of looking at things, they're really better categorized as independent. We can talk about that if you'd like to later. There are, by the way, 45,000 Christian denominations in the world, and that's good because there's a lot of variety. It's bad because there's a lot of schism, and you have churches splitting all the time, and that's a weakness that other people see in Christianity, and wonder why if unity is one of your themes, why is there so much division? So that's something that we have to deal with as well, and a lot of those are in the Protestant and independent groups because there's more fragmentation in those groups. All right, now let's talk about evangelicals for a minute. And and you see even a more profound shift here, which is why I wanted to highlight this too. And this is my tradition. I mean, I grew up Lutheran, but I was an evangelical from a very young age. And so this is my tribe here. So 1900, 92% were in the North. Remember, of all Christians, it was 81%. And then today it's 77% in the global South. So of all groups, evangelicals have the least reason to live out a Western version of Christianity, because we are really better represented by the global South. And yet a lot of the ideas, a lot of the books and plans and music still comes from the North. And there's nothing wrong with all of that stuff, but it isn't who we are. That's the point that I'm trying to make. So here, look at that graph there. That shows even more of a shift to the South. And then I'll just show you the current situation for Pentecostals and Charismatics, 86% in the South. So that's a profound shift and a profound number. And Pentecostals are starting to think about what does it mean to be mainly a global South religion, especially in relation to mission, because you have proximity here with many people who still need to hear the gospel. Okay, back to the denominations. One question to ask then is, with 45,000 denominations, are we a divided community? Is this how people see us? Or are we really a unified body? And notice that I use a Korean car here because of Christianity. So I think this is who we are, and I think this is difficult. So difficult to work in this direction, but it's something we should definitely think about as we become more global and yet are divided. So we are, in a sense, we're divided by denominations, perhaps by language too. What about language? Okay, so here's the top mother tongues of Christianity worldwide. Remember, this includes all types of Christians, and Spanish is actually the #1 mother tongue, not because of Spain, of course, but because of Latin America. The second is English, and with the USA being the largest country of Christians who speak English, even though this is the British royal family, which I support has new meaning in recent years. This is older photograph, but I don't want to get into that. Anyway, third is the Portuguese language, which again is not because of little Portugal, but because of Brazil, and then other countries in Africa. Then we have Russian. This is because of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is not just in Russia, but all around the world. And fifth is Chinese, Mandarin, and that's new, and that's partly it's the diaspora of Chinese Christians all around the world, but it's also in China itself. So, and if we went down the list, which is in our atlas and other places, you'd see the European languages are going down the list over time, and Asian and African and Latin American languages coming up the list. So why then are why do we worship mainly with Western hymns and choruses? Doesn't Christianity favor indigenous worship? And one of the things that I've noticed, I travel a lot for my job, and when I go even to remote places, let's say Mongolia, and I attend a church service, I already know all of the hymns, and that should not be the case. There's nothing wrong with those hymns, but it really we need indigenous worship, which is a new field of study now that Christianity is so diverse. We have this study called ethnodoxology. So that's something we have to consider. And this is a wonderful field of study and, of course, initiative around the world as we have grown. Okay, here's a few quick facts, and then I'll wrap things up. Africa, here's African Christianity. You can see it's mainly to the south. Christianity grew from 9% of Africa in 1900 to 49% in 2020, but most of the Christians are in the south of Africa. I was at an evangelical conference in Wittenberg in 2017 to celebrate 500 years of the Protestant Reformation, and I presented our research showing that over 40% of all Protestants in 2017 were Africans. That's the big red circle there, right? But out of the 100 people in this meeting in Germany, only a few were Africans. And I was sitting next to a leader from Ghana when someone from the stage said that Africans were welcome at the table in the evangelical movement. My colleague turned to me and quickly recounted a Ghanaian proverb. He said this. He said, "It's good if you invite me to your table, but it's far better if you invite me into the kitchen." And I think this is the nature of our problem, is that we still have Western Christianity inviting everybody. Western Christians are excited about the growth of Christianity around the world, but they're still setting the menu in most venues like this, when what we need is everyone in the kitchen if we're going to see who we really are. And I hope that metaphor is helpful to you. Oh, here's Africans in the kitchen. The food is going to be a lot better as well. So that's a good metaphor. In Asia, here's what Asia looks like. We have Asia is the most religiously diverse place of all places, which isn't going to surprise you. Asia was 2% Christian in 1900. Now it's about 8%. That's because of Christianity growing in various places. But you can see where Christians fit in a bubble graph like this, which we have in our encyclopedia. Then Europe, of course, Christianity has fallen. It actually got a little bit of a boost with the collapse of communism because Russia is considered part of Europe. And so it got a little boost, but now secularization and immigration is also pushing this number down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, by the way. So we have to be careful how we interpret these graphs. And Latin America is changing mainly by the growth of Protestant churches and evangelical churches and Pentecostal churches. So it's changing more internally than it is as a percentage of the whole. And Northern America, we're experiencing more religious diversity, but it's still largely Christian, though that number is going down, and there are more agnostics, there's more immigration. So there's much to do along those lines. Oceania is experiencing a loss. There was quite a bit of growth over time as Christianity spread throughout the islands, but then Australia and New Zealand are dominant, by their size, and this is showing a drop here. Okay, the Middle East is where we've seen the biggest change. The Middle East is being emptied of its Christian community, and that's something for us to consider, because Christians globally are not really as active in doing something about this as I think we could be. So, places like Turkey was 25% Christian in 1900. Turkey is 0.3% Christian today. And we could tell you might know the reasons for that, but that's something for us to consider. Let's think about religions for a minute. Here's the religious situation in the world, with again, not a world that's totally secular as many people expected. In fact, we're getting a little bit more religious each year as the globe, because the people with religious backgrounds have more children, for one thing, but they're also much more engaged in conversion, even though that some places are becoming more secular at the same time. So that's something to consider. You'll be happy to know, and I didn't do this just for you, this is in our standard presentation, because we study diversity, And Singapore is the most diverse country in the world religiously because there's no group, that's more than 30 or 35% of the total. And that is unusual because most countries have a majority. And we're interested that the world's becoming an increasingly diverse place as people move around. This is religiously diverse we're talking about. So we're excited about that. And I was actually in Singapore in 2017, and we were studying religious diversity and the fact that people don't always get along. And I was reading in the Straits Times a new study that showed that 9 out of 10 Singaporeans were comfortable living and working with people of other ethnicities or religions. And I had just seen a study in the United States, 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10 in the United States. And I thought to myself, why are people in the United States writing books about how to get along with other people? I think people in Singapore should write the books that the rest of us read. And I have felt this way for a long time. We need actually Christians from around the world to inform the rest of Christianity how to get along with others. The biggest shift in religion has been Christians and Muslims. 33% of the world's population in 1800 together, the two faiths. And that will eventually be 66%, probably before the year 2100. So 2/3 of all the people in the world are going to be either Christian or Muslim. So that's another thing for us to consider. We also study peoples and places. We study cities with the most Christians. And if we had time to look carefully at this, you wouldn't be surprised that in 1900, those cities were almost all in the north. In the year 2020, they're mainly in the south. All right. And the fact that Christianity is becoming more urban over time, certainly in China, but all around the world, we're becoming a more urban faith. The fact that we speak all these languages and there's all these different groups, and the fact that Christianity is unevenly divided really between all of these groups. And that's where the unreached peoples concept comes from, is the idea that some peoples have a lot of access, others do not. And we'll talk more about that in September. That's what we're going to look at. And mission, we will also talk about. And again, the countries that send and receive the most missionaries, and there's more sending now from the global south than there has been in the past. But the #1 country to receive missionaries is the United States. Maybe we'll talk about that in September. Maybe it doesn't seem to be to make sense, but that is a problem as well. Now, let me just end with two little facts. We're going to come back to this one. This is a teaser, I guess, for our September time when we focus on mission. Our research shows that 87% of all Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists, which is the bulk of the non-Christian world, do not personally know a Christian. And so that personal friendship, personal contact gap is a very significant one that needs to be addressed. And again, I would be much more likely to listen to a Singaporean Christian than an American one about what to do about that. To me, that makes more sense. Hospitality and friendship is a part of this. And we invite, my wife Tricia teaches English as a second language. We invite everybody to our home on holidays and other events. And most of them have never been invited to an American home. We're always the first ones, and it really should not be like that. So that's a big part of the future of Christianity. And then I'll end with this. There's a Nigerian theologian who I think helps us to get our minds around what has happened and what needs to happen. So he captures this because we want a truly global Christianity. That's my main point for today. And he says this: Christianity is not truly global by its mere presence in many countries in the world. It is truly global when two criteria are met. First, the local communities of the world's nations are given the freedom to rethink and re-express Christianity's teaching about God's relationship with the world through Jesus Christ, self-theologizing, okay? And second, the local communities see themselves as equals, conversing and critiquing each other and contributing theologically to Christianity's long tradition. So we need to learn from each other in the global church in a way in which everyone has freedom to express their faith in an indigenous fashion, worship, theology, everything. And that's what's going to bring about a truly global Christianity. So thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
First of all, thank you, Professor Johnson, for your labor of love in doing such an immense and important study. And bringing together huge amounts of data and organizing it is no mean feat. So thank you for giving Christianity in many parts of the world a face and a voice, for taking us a little back to the past to explore the future and a tour around the world. Thank you, Lisman and team, for organizing this and for the opportunity for me to provide a short response and reflection to the speaker. So just a little about myself before I begin. I'm a PhD student in theology and culture at Fuller, and I've pastored in cross-cultural settings in Singapore and US. And I'm particularly interested in how we practice the worship of the Judeo-Christian God as people connected to Asia. And so before I begin, I would like to first preface that, as earlier mentioned by Dr. Johnson, Asia is the most religiously diverse continent, and its diversity is even found beyond what is in Singapore. And so as we claim to be the most diverse country in the world, I think what we experience as a nation and even as individuals will differ. And in fact, while it was earlier mentioned that the world is becoming more religious, actually in Singapore, atheism is on the rise, according to our latest census in 2020. So in other words, I do not dare to overgeneralize or claim to speak for the whole of Asia. And we must not apply wholesale what's happening to us here in Singapore to the rest of Asia either. But I don't think we are irrelevant to the rest of Asia either, or to the West even. And as a country that does send many missionaries out to Asia, we love to travel around the region. We closely relate to the international sphere in our political realm and in our daily lives. We too cannot be ignorant about movements and trends happening around us. And so with the limited time I have, I will not be rehashing all the good stuff that Prof. Johnson has presented, but I would like to just present some reflections on the now what, especially as a Singaporean Chinese who has once pastored in a local Chinese-speaking church. And now I am also doing academia in the West. So it's interesting for me to reflect on all these. And my response hopes to briefly highlight some opportunities and challenges of global Christianity in Singapore based on the two criteria that was last mentioned by Professor Todd in his closing quote by the Nigerian theologian Victor Ezekwo. So that Christianity is not truly global by the mere presence of it in many countries of the world. It is truly global when two criteria are met. First, local communities are given the freedom to rethink and re-express Christianity through Christianity's teaching about God's relationship with the world through Jesus Christ. And secondly, local communities see themselves as equals, conversing and critiquing each other and contributing theologically to Christianity's long tradition. And these two aspects of global Christianity resonate deeply with me as I consider it a byproduct of the Great Commission, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with. And that Christianity has gone around the world and played a part in globalization itself. So making disciples of all nations means not only making disciples in Singapore and in Asia, but is to take very seriously that Christianity is in a global world, a globalized world, right? As Singaporeans connected to Asia and beyond. However, we do have some way to achieve these ideals of freedom and equality of thought and expression. And so I will share some realities on the ground in Singapore and, as mentioned, highlight some opportunities and challenges about global Christianity. So my first point is the first part of the quote, where local communities are given the freedom to rethink and re-express Christianity's teaching about God's relationship with the world through Christ. I'll spend a bit more time on this and because it dovetails into point number 2. So on opportunities, I think we have the freedom and diverse resources. So while Christianity first arrived at our shores about 200 years ago with the British colony, it has played a key role in helping Singapore become an affluent and secular society. We have a general sense of religious freedom, and Christianity in Singapore has grown to be embraced by highly affluent and highly educated, Western educated people. And we try to maintain an amicable relationship with the local government. And we have religious harmony and social political stability. So this makes us an attractive location for even international missions organizations, key offices to be here. So for example, like SIM, East Asia, OMF. And we have also many accredited seminaries that attract people from all over Asia and sometimes even Europe and the West. And so many churches have the resources not just only to do ministries within its 4 walls, but also to send out missionaries. And we have a diverse portfolio of ministries that churches do, or parachurch organizations do, to outreach to foreigners, to outreach to domestic helpers, blue-collar workers, and provide social services, etc. So however, rethinking and re-expressing Christianity's teaching is highly challenging precisely due to the diversity that we have here. And the diversity doesn't just include religious diversity, but generations, language, education, even social economic status and dynamics. So Christian publisher Graceworks has recently completed the results of the Generation Project, which is a project that seeks to help generations increase empathy for one another through an in-depth ethnographic research and literature review. And they note that today in Singapore, there are at least 5 generations living and working and worshiping together. And each generation has been shaped by different formative experiences. For example, the silent generation was shaped by the World War II and they went through the Great Depression. Gen X and onwards, the age of the internet and information. And now the impact of globalization and even the pandemic. So the ways that they view life and faith are not just different, but they are constantly in flux. And to throw in the mix, right, generations are not split by age and experience, but as I mentioned, language, ethnicity, education, socioeconomic status. Right. So here's a chart on Christians in Singapore by ethnicity. And you can see the very big green portion is 92% Chinese, 3.8% Indian and others, and then 0.4% Malays. And so 92% of Singaporean Christians are ethnically Chinese. And once upon a time, not too long ago, actually, there were immigrants who spoke many different Chinese languages. And so when we look into the origins of Singaporean Christian Chinese, it becomes even more diverse. Right. And even among Singaporean Chinese per se, not even the Christians, right? We see that more and more, a growing number are from different parts of Asia. So they are not locally born because of our falling birth rate. Right, so we see a 1/4 from Malaysia, significantly growing number from China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. And the census itself, which I take all these data from, right, notes that immigrants are helping to moderate low birth rates. And for both Chinese and Indians, right, which are below 1 right now. And these 2 races make up the ethnic majority of current Singaporean Christians. And academic qualifications wise, 50% of Singaporean Christians are university graduates, and it doesn't take much to observe that English-speaking Chinese majority churches are usually the ones with the most resources and wealth. So what do these figures mean? Well, Singapore Christians are a fascinating mix of being majority race and even wealth, but not the majority religion. We are in a tiny country, but a highly globalized one. And so Christianity has only been in Singapore for about 200 years. It has hardly settled itself, but changes are taking place all over and very often in a globalized world. So what works for us today may not work for the next generation. And with the falling birth rate in Singapore, what is Singaporean Chinese today will look very different in the future with the growing number of Chinese immigrants from different parts of Asia and their offspring. And so while we may seem to be comfortable living and working with people of different ethnicities and religions, I dare say that among us, we do know what biases and prejudices do remain, especially towards other races and other immigrant communities. And having served in a Chinese church myself, reaching out to immigrant communities remains a challenge. There's often, even implicit racism that I hear from the congregation and an inward-looking desire for comfort. So continuing the mission work of God means that we need to rethink and re-express Christianity's teaching on what it means to make disciples of God's kingdom to the ends of the earth. And that also includes being aware of the shifting dynamics of people around us, even in Singapore. So may this freedom and privilege that we have as a majority race not fool us into living comfortably as though we are the majority religion, which we are not. We are only 20%, and that we are not thinking and re-expressing what Christianity may mean to the diversity of ethnicities and cultures around us. And so this leads me to briefly talk about part 2 of our Nigerian Brothers quote, which I find is the much needed step to take in order to achieve part 1. So point 2 is where local communities see themselves as equals, right? Conversing and critiquing each other and contributing theologically to Christianity's long tradition. So while Singapore is home to many Christian denominations, whether local church communities see each other as equals or have the openness of conversation, of critiquing one another, has its challenges and opportunities. For example, I would like to refer to Professor Johnson's point that Pentecostalism is the fastest growing denomination in the world. Well, it is true here in Singapore too, that Pentecostal churches account for 1/3 of all the churches here, of the Christians here actually. And the 4 most well-known mega churches have a weekly attendance that surpasses the 3 oldest mainline denominations combined. And in fact, many Anglicans and Methodists have also experienced Pentecostal renewals of different waves too. But there is also a history where Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement have been looked upon with suspicion by a significant number of non-Pentecostal churches. And this still exists today, even among Christians, other Christians in Asia. And ironically, the growth of Pentecostalism in Singapore is that Pentecostal spirituality is directed and informed by many elements of folk religion. And this is noted by theologians and sociologists. So according to Anita Chia, a lecturer at TCA College, power manifestations or signs, wonders, and miracles in Pentecostal theology are often considered congruent with the cosmology of Chinese. So even though most non-Christian Chinese in Singapore believe in Chinese cosmology or Chinese folk religion, which some of us here have that background, a mix of Buddhism, Taoism, ancestor worship, not many churches will consciously address the gospel in light of these beliefs. I do know of churches trying to integrate these, but these questions are often come up more in Chinese educated or Mandarin speaking churches. Right. So for churches, especially those with Western educated members, Chinese folk religiosity can be unfamiliar, it can be unaddressed or just rejected. Right? And this is what Paul Hebert, a missiologist, calls the excluded middle, where the realities of spirits from ancestors to demons is pervasive in the lived experiences of many Christians, and these are not adequately addressed. And I'm sure, Professor Johnson, you know these too. So this zone, this excluded middle zone, grows wider as Pentecostal-like mega churches have also been recently in trouble for, in news and often criticized for prosperity gospel or hyper grace teachings. Some even doubt their salvation, or much less consider them part of Christianity's tradition. And again, these critics are not just in Singapore, but also in other parts of Asia. So perhaps the challenge to see people as equals in conversation extends beyond those from other ethnicities, or it extends beyond holding denominational and theological differences. We also have people from different socioeconomic statuses. And I think the question is to ask ourselves, are they also equals in conversations in our own churches right now? Are we aware of those with mental health, disabilities, struggles, and even sexual struggles? And of course, furthermore, almost half of Singapore is made up of foreigners, 40% to be exact, right? And so many foreigners, at our doorstep, some even within our doors as domestic helpers. And so how are we reaching out to them? Where is their place in our lives? And even when they become Christians, will they be equals in conversation in our churches? And so on this point and in conclusion, I would like to, sorry, I missed one slide, right. Appeal to the reformer John Calvin's thoughts on wisdom to navigate being global Christians living in a global space. So at the start of his Institutes, his magnum opus, Calvin says that true and solid wisdom consists in the knowledge of God in ourselves. And I'm just reflecting on how, many of us who are educated Singaporeans, we love seeking the knowledge of God, right? Just in general, the Bible is so important. And that's one reason why we are here tonight too. And perhaps it's crucial to ask, how well do we know ourselves and our neighbors who do not look the same as us? How can we live out God's word in relevant, responsible, and meaningful ways? And I really like what Asian American psychologist David Wang calls this intercultural competence. That we do, just growing up in a multicultural space doesn't automatically mean that we are intercultural, right? To be able to dialogue and build friendships with other communities that we may avoid or we are hardly exposed to. And so, this intercultural competence consists of the ability to manage the anxiety of difference, to take on the perspective of others, to relate across these differences and regulate the anxiety that comes up when we come head on with what we don't like or agree with. And so I would like to just slightly paraphrase this quote for our Singaporean context. Christianity is not truly global by the mere presence of globalization in our nation. It is truly global when the two criteria of having the freedom to rethink and re-express Christianity and to see each other as local and to converse, right, to have dialogue, when that takes place. And so here are some closing questions I have for ourselves, and perhaps to Professor Johnson in particular. I think the influence from the West in the globalizing world is inevitable, especially for a country like Singapore. So what are your thoughts perhaps on this idea of a global Christianity for Singapore, which we recognize that it's almost irreversible to talk about indigenous worship, because if whose worship is it in Singapore, right? We are majority Chinese. So if we are talking about indigenous, we may fall into just doing things in our own way. Yeah. And how do we recognize and reach out and embrace other ethnic groups around us too? And so this is my question to you. And right before I end, I just want to take a minute to quickly share a couple of resources by Christians in Singapore who I feel have been doing the hard work of leading the way in inviting people into our proverbial kitchen. So Graceworks, the Generations Project, which I mentioned earlier, is very accessible, can be found on the Graceworks website. And one of the recent attempts to bring other voices around Southeast Asia together is this book called Missions in Southeast Asia, Diversity and Unity in God's Design. So it's edited by Dr. Kwa Kim Pyok of BGST and Dr. Samuel Law, and published by Langham. And there are two organizations I just quickly highlight. I'm not limited to these, of course. They're started by Singaporeans, and Micah Singapore, it's a community of people passionate seeking shalom through justice and integral missions. And Kin, champions for people with disabilities to be included in church. So they provide training, partnerships, and resources. They even partner with Uni of Aberdeen's Center of Autism and Theology and Western Theological Seminary in the US. So their book is available on the Graceworks website too. So indeed, I look forward to the day that more true, solid, and wise voices from Southeast Asia find their way within their own communities and onto a platform of all nations, that disciples here will truly be seen as equals by the West to learn with and from. And I believe with more of the likes of GoForth and Professor Todd for advocating for us, that time is drawing near. Thank you.